I'm Andrew Joseph Keith. I'm an artist and sculptor and online sculpting instructor, and I put together a sculpture competition that's coming up. It's going to be a week from today, so it'll start April 24th. It'll go for 2 weeks, end on May 8th. It should be really fun. If you haven't seen the original video that announces the competition, that goes more in depth on the details of the competition. In this video, I want to go over the judging criteria, so what I'll be using as I'm judging the competition and deciding who's going to win that competition. It should be a really fun competition. It's free to participate, so if you haven't signed up already, there's a link down in the description below to sign up, and you'll be added to my email list, and that's where I'll send out more information and the photos and everything that you need to know for the competition. There's also going to be live streams. Those will be on the Proco 3D YouTube channel, so make sure that you're subscribed over there and that you're on the email list so you get notified once those live streams are up, and they'll be available afterwards as well. So here are 10 different criteria that I'm going to be using when judging the sculptures that you guys are submitting. So if you want, you can take a screenshot of these 10 criteria, things that I'm looking at and I'm considering that'll add points or take away points from your sculpture. So I'm just going to quickly go over some of these. Some of these I have additional comments that I'd like to add. So the number one is documentation and photographs. And each of these I'm thinking like judging at 1 to 10 as far as a score. So this competition is going to be judged on photographs. And so I want to make sure that you guys are taking into consideration, good lighting, not having distracting backgrounds. When I'm sculpting something like this, I usually have a key light, and that's about 45 degrees and above the camera when I'm sculpting. And then I also have a backlight that's behind, a little bit behind and to the side. And I feel like that just gives a nice lighting for sculptures. Also, when I'm doing these videos, this is the type of lighting that I have. And then I just have a black sheet that I put in the background so that it's not too distracting of a background. So that's the situation that I prefer. But if you want to have just like a clean white or a clean gray background, I just want to make sure that there's nothing distracting, not like clutter or anything like that. You want to make sure that the sculpture isn't too backlit, because that makes the sculpture lose some of the details. Like if I was to take a picture of this sculpture in front of a window, I'd be able to see the silhouette, but I wouldn't be able to see that much of the information. So even though I understand this isn't going to be a finished sculpture or I should say it's going to be in the original clay, so it doesn't have to be cast or anything, but it still should be presented as if it's, going to be for sale online. So I just want to see a clean background, good lighting that puts it, put it in its best lighting. You want it to look nice. So have that, that's the number one consideration I want you guys to take into account. Another thing, when you're taking photographs, I recommend taking photographs at about the waist level of the sculpture and then backing up away from the sculpture, because if you're too close, then it'll exaggerate the parts of the sculpture that are closer to the camera just because of perspective. So if you have a nicer camera, then I'd recommend backing away and then zooming in a little bit. And if you don't have a camera that's able to do that, then just kind of try to take it as far back as is comfortable, but I do want to be able to see the details. So take it a little bit far back and about at waist height, I think is usually what looks best. So you definitely don't want to take it from super extreme angles unless there's a detail that you want to include in the references. Then you could, take a close-up of that detail. But in general, I want to have several images of the sculpture looking at it. So when you're submitting those images over at Proco.com, I want to make sure that I have a lot of visual information to judge off of. So you'll take a picture and then turn it just a little bit, take a picture, and you can submit up to 10 images. So take 10 images from different angles, and I want to make sure that there's a lot of visual information for me to judge your sculptures off of. Number 2 is accurate proportions. I like the Robert Beverly Hale cranial unit system for building wire armatures. Proco has a great video on that measuring system. That's the system I use to build my wire armatures. Another thing that can help with proportions is one of the sponsors for the competition. That's the DaVinci Eye app, and that allows you to just overlay the reference image that you'll have with the camera of your phone. And that way you can just check to make sure that the proportions are accurate just by looking through your phone and seeing the sculpture. So there's a couple things to have in mind. Just make sure the proportions are correct. Number 3 is the sculpture anatomically correct? And for this one, there's no easy fix. If you're not super familiar with anatomy, then I'd say it's extra important just to study your reference and try to represent your reference. But I would say pay special attention to the areas around where there's joints and things like that, areas of the shoulder, the hands, the face, the waist, those areas, the knee. Those areas, the anatomy is fairly important, and so I want to see that you understand the anatomy, or at least that you were able to observe the reference accurately and represent that anatomy in a way that feels right. So number 4 is gesture. The gesture of the pose, or the movement of the pose. I really like gesture, and so if I was going to err, I would err on the side of adding a little bit too much gesture rather than it being too stiff. If you're going to push anything, make sure that you're pushing it in a way that adds movement or adds interest and adds flow to the sculpture, and not a way that makes it stiffer or look upright, which tends to be when people make a mistake, especially beginners. When they make a mistake, usually it's to make the sculpture a little bit too stiff and feels kind of like a board or something like that. So just my personal taste, I'd rather it be a little bit more gesture, either accurate or more gesture than the photo references. And I don't want to see it become too stiff, just because that's not something that I like. Other people might feel differently, but that's how I'm going to be the judge. So that's just a little insight into how I feel about gesture. And with that gesture, it's important to maintain the structure when you're pushing the gesture. So I want to see that there's still the structure of the rib cage, the box of the pelvis, the head, that everything still feels cohesive and that it works together and it feels natural. But I'm okay if you're push that gesture a little bit farther than what the references have. Number 5 is balance. So does it feel like the sculpture is going to tip over anyway? And some of that can be the photos that you're taking. So if you're taking photos, make sure that it feels balanced, that it doesn't feel like, if you have your camera at one angle, then it might feel like the sculpture is going to tip over. So make sure that the sculpture doesn't feel like it's going to tip over. And then when you're taking your references, make sure that those photo references show that the sculpture looks good and is upright. That's from a little bit ways back so that I can see the sculpture as a whole. So number 6 is the head. So I'm just going to be looking at the head. That's an important part of the sculpture. And so the details of the head, the facial features, that's part of the figure. The most important part, arguably. It's the most important part. That's where our eyes go first. So I'm going to be judging, does this head look right? Does the proportions of the head feel right? Do the proportions of the features feel right? That's number 6. Number 7 is the hands and feet. These are just difficult areas. And so for somebody that's going to win the competition, I want to see that they understand or were at least able to represent the hands and feet in a way that doesn't feel like they were made by AI generated, where they don't really understand hands, and so there's fingers coming out in weird places. So I want to make sure that the hands and feet feel right and go along with the rest of the sculpture. Number 8 is the surface texture, and if the sculpture is cohesive. So by that I mean, does the whole sculpture feel about at the same level? So I don't want to see something where the head is maybe super developed, super realistic, but then the hands and the feet or the lower body just looks like you haven't gotten to it. I want to see, does it feel like they've brought the whole sculpture to the same level? And you get to decide what level of detail you want to go for. There's one of my favorite sculptors is Leroy Transfield, and he has a very sketchy, loose style of sculpting. He doesn't go in and sculpt a lot of details or make it a super realistic skin texture or anything like that, but he's able to represent the form in a way that's very interesting, and he adds gesture to it, and he picks and chooses what parts of the anatomy that he wants to bring forward to the viewer's attention. And so you can just tell that he's thought a lot about the way that he represents the sculpture, and he makes it a cohesive sculpture. So even though a lot of the sculptures that he does are not they're not detailed to the point where you'd say oh, it looks like you just took a cast of the person, but they're very beautifully done sculptures. And I've done sculpture competitions with him, and he almost always wins the sculpture competitions just because his work feels so It feels so alive and it's really interesting, and I really look up to him. So I'm not saying that there has to be so much detail in the sculpture that you have to be able to see all the wrinkles of the hands or anything like that. I just want the whole sculpture to feel like it's treated in a similar way. That's what I mean when I say cohesive. Number 9 is the style, and so that goes off a little bit of what I was saying before. Then I'm okay if you have some stylistic elements, if there's some simplification or things like that, but I don't want an abstract figure sculpture like I do. I've done abstract stone sculptures. That's not what I'm looking for in this particular sculpture competition. You can choose what level of detail that you want to go. Just be thinking about that. I don't want it to be so stylized that it's completely divorced from reality, from what you're actually observing in the reference. That's just not what I'm looking for. So if you do stylize anything or make anything or simplify anything, I want it to be within the context of the principles that we've gone over in the Figure Sculpting Fundamentals course. So in a way that keeps the structure, that it keeps the gesture and foundation of the pose, and that's in keeping with traditional sculpting techniques. Number 10 is likeness. How close did you get to the references that were provided? And again, I'm okay with there being some deviation from the references, but if there is, I want it to be in the direction of making a more interesting sculpture, making something that looks better than the references. I don't want it to be in the direction of making something that's distracting, or maybe it just feels like you couldn't get it right, but you were trying for it. So when it comes to likeness, in reality, when you're showing a sculpture in the gallery, they won't see the photo references that you used or the person that you used as a reference. So this one is not as important to me as, is it a good sculpture? Is it a good looking sculpture? And so I can forgive if it doesn't look exactly like the model, if it's still interesting and it still has proportions that feel like, oh yeah, that could be a person that looks natural. It doesn't look like somebody with unrealistic features or anything like that. But if it is very close to the model and maybe there's a really good likeness of the face, that's really impressive. And so I think that'll add on points. Any deviations from what you're seeing in the references, I just want them to be in the direction of making it more interesting and a more beautiful or well done sculpture, well thought out sculpture. Okay, so each of these 10 things, you can imagine, it's just a scorecard, 1 out of 10 on each of these things. These are the metrics that I'm going to be using, the things that I'm going to be thinking about. And so you can write these things down and be thinking about them as you're sculpting, as you're thinking about how to design the sculpture, and as you're taking references. Now, obviously, there is some subjectivity to judging something like a sculpture, and it's really hard to get away from that. I'm hoping that with this criteria, it'll give some objectivity to it. Things like style, there's just different styles that people like. Things like gesture, like I mentioned, I just happen to really like gesture. And so those are things that, each person that's judging, they're going to lean towards different tendencies on what they put value on. So it is kind of difficult. Hopefully nobody will be too upset with the judging. I know it's going to be difficult. There's a lot of people that are interested in this sculpture competition. Hopefully that means that there's going to be a lot of submissions, but then it does become difficult. It makes my job hard as the judge to be able to say like, okay, these are the top 10, the top 3, and the number 1 sculpture. So hopefully you guys will have a little bit of patience with me, but I'm really excited to see what you guys can produce. I'm excited for this 2-week competition. I think it'll be really fun. Hopefully we'll do more types of competitions or sculpture challenges in the near future. Again, I want to give a shout out to our judges. So that's posespace.com, which is providing the references. They provide great references for people that are interested in sculpting because they provide like 24 different angles of each pose. So it's really useful for sculptors. There's the DaVinci Eye app, which I really like as a way to check yourself early on in the process to make sure the proportions and gesture are all right. There's Proco.com, which is where I teach my online courses, and they have great courses. One of my favorites is the Anatomy for Artists course. And so just a great resource over at Proco.com. Blick Art Materials has also donated a $100 gift card. And so that'll be another prize that will be included. I just want you guys to appreciate the sponsors. Go out and support them if you can. The prizes wouldn't be what they are without those sponsors. I couldn't have done $1,000 prizes out of my own pocket. So I really appreciate the way that they've supported this competition. Again, if you haven't signed up, go down to the link below, sign up for the competition. You'll be added to my email list. We'll get going on the competition. If you're watching this afterwards and the competition has already been over, I think the references will still be available. And if you wanted to do this sculpture just on your own time after the competition, feel free to do that. I'll try to keep the link available and change it after the competition is over so that you at least get the references, the free references, and are able to do a sculpture of your own and then maybe compare it with some of the sculptures that people have submitted for this competition. If you want more information, go watch the video on the Proco 3D YouTube channel that goes over the competition, talks about the prizes. Hopefully you found this video helpful. I'm really excited. Stay creative, stay productive. I'll see you in the next video.